la doctora Elsdon Baker es acompañada por el doctor Ignacio Silva, quien hará una presentación breve de su currícula. La ponencia de la doctora se intitula Communicating Evolution in a Globalized World, The Role of Cultural Relations and Dialogue. Gracias.
Buenas, de nuevo. Bien. La doctora Elsdon Baker ha trabajado en sus investigaciones académicas. Ha estudiado ciencias del medio ambiente, completando su doctorado en Historia y Filosofía de la Ciencia, en especial Historia y Filosofía de la Teoría de la Evolución, explorando en particular las maneras en que el uso de la terminología sin diferenciar puede restringir el discurso científico, histórico como el contemporáneo, sobre los conceptos claves de la teoría de la evolución. Y trabaja actualmente en justamente esto, ¿no? Comunicación de la ciencia. Y en este sentido está trabajando, es la directora del programa Belief in Dialogue del British Council, un programa global que tiene como objetivo desarrollar el entendimiento entre diferentes comunidades en temas de diversidad y cultura.
Okay, can I just check? You can all hear me clearly? Is that okay? Okay, brilliant, thank you. Well, firstly, I'd just like to say thank you. Oh, am I not... louder? Louder, okay. I'm in closer. Sorry, I speak very quietly, so I'm aware that... I like to think it's because I'm understated, but you'll see from the paper that I'm not. Okay. Firstly, I'd like to say a very quick thank you to the host here at the University of Panamericana and also to the organisers at the University of Oxford. I'm sure this is going to be a very fruitful...
I'm sorry, I just can't hear you.
You can't...
I can't hear you.
Okay. Is the microphone on? Yes. Yeah, okay. Sorry. Okay, can you hear me now? Yes, great. It's fantastic. Okay. Firstly, I was just saying I would like to say thank you to the organisers and hosts here at the University at Panamericana and also to the organisers at the University of Oxford. In my experience, organising this kind of conference is no mean feat, and I'm very impressed to see that there are people from 13 different countries here. So thank you to our organisers, and particularly to Ignacio and Hector, because I know that a lot of hard work has gone into this event. And I'm sure that it's going to be very beneficial to have us all here together. Okay, so really, obviously, my role at the British Council at the moment is working on a programme called Belief in Dialogue. The key aim of that programme is to develop safe spaces for open dialogue about key global issues today. And as I'm sure we'll explore throughout this conference, one of those issues is the perception of a clash between science and faith perspectives. In my previous role at the British Council, I ran a programme called Darwin Now. You can see the nice logo up there, which I'll explore a little bit as we go through this paper. The work that I'm going to be talking about today partly relates to some of the work that we did in Darwin Now, but also to some of my ongoing academic research into science communication and to the way that people interact with and engage with ideas around evolutionary theory globally. Okay, so to start off, really I want to ask two key questions today. Why does the science and belief matter so much in terms of cultural relations? What impact does the science and belief debate have in its wider geopolitical context? And secondly, what are the drivers behind the perception of a clash between science and faith? Are they, as might be popularly represented, due to an ongoing war between science on behalf of faith leaders and communities? Or is the perception of a necessary clash more recently driven by non-faith-based ideological agendas? And indeed, does the clash thesis really represent the majority public perception? The area of scientific research which tends to elicit the most hostile responses from both ends of the faith-non-faith spectrum is evolutionary theory. This is hardly surprising. We as humans are quite self-absorbed, we're quite navel-gazing, and we tend to be quite self-interested. And evolutionary theory certainly has a lot of human interest stories attached to it. And evolutionary theory, as no doubt you're all aware, has throughout its history been linked to issues well outside of the bounds of scientific inquiry. Thank you. Okay. Both of them. I'm that quiet. Okay, this makes it difficult with the papers. But, okay. I'll resolve this. Okay. So, as I was saying, in the past 150 years, discussions about the nature of evolutionary theory have been linked to a lot of areas outside of the realms of scientific inquiry. The kind of mechanisms in evolutionary processes have been linked to questions not only about where we come from as a species, but why we function in the way we do as a society, and where we as a society and also as a species are going towards. The legacy of evolutionary theories and Darwin himself being misrepresented as being intrinsically linked to areas of work such as eugenical programs, racial concepts, and some of the horrors of the early 20th century have left their mark on the way that not only Darwinism has been communicated, but also how it's received by some communities globally. The public communication of Darwinism in the US and UK, and to a degree internationally, has however been more recently affected by an increasingly polarised debate between two supposedly warring groups, the creationists and the new atheists. Darwin's work, then, its historical and current representation are central to the understanding not only of modern evolutionary biology, but they also cut across key contemporary issues in cultural relations. These discussions about Darwinism are uniquely placed at the nexus between debates involving the role of science in society and the relationship between science and religion, and by extension, reason and faith in its geopolitical context. Increasingly, we see that discussions in the public sphere about a perceived clash between Darwinism and faith are being linked into wider clash narratives, not least in the past decade in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the US and the 7/7 terrorist bombings in the UK. Against this background, it's very hard to remove the communication of Darwinism from its wider political and ideological context. Indeed, I argue not to engage with this backdrop, in particular with the reasons for the perceptions of a clash between evolution and faith, and to take a solely show them the evidence style approach to communicating evolution, is in some cases counterproductive. The popular representation of Darwinism often hinges on the perception of a clash between worldviews and a misrepresentation of geographically distinct faith communities and science communities as being locked in a necessary conflict. For example, this has been characterised by high-profile atheists or science communicators linking their perception of a rise in creationist discourses to an oversimplified perception of increasing tensions between Muslim and non-Muslim communities. Another example would be the ongoing assumptions or concerns about the export of an American-style creationism into other regions internationally. We cannot ignore the fact that Darwinism, whether rightly or wrongly, is seen in some ways to be intrinsically controversial. Its communication has an interesting history in its own right, and whilst there were some in the 1860s who felt threatened by the publication of Origin of Species, as countless historians have argued, this is not necessarily representative of the response of many theologians or people of faith at the time. It is, in fact, often, unfortunately, necessary to point out, even at the basic level, that Darwin himself was by no means an atheist, nor were some of his more ardent supporters. However, Darwinism, in more recent years, has been very heavily conflated with an atheist agenda. This, in turn, has led to a perception in some societies that to be a Darwinian is to accept atheism, and to be a creationist is to reject atheism. Scientific content does not necessarily even come into these discussions, and it's sometimes evident that those that are classing themselves as creationists or are classed as creationists by others are more than comfortable with some of the processes that we would expect to see within evolutionary theory. So, for example, common ancestry or geological time. Rather, it is the implicit assumption that Darwinism precludes a role for even a God of first cause that is at the heart of this debate. And this is the question that is perhaps beyond the realms of scientific endeavour and takes us into the realms of philosophical discourse. In the public representation, particularly again in the US and the UK, it has become an either-or decision. Either you accept evolutionary theory and lose your faith, or you maintain your faith and reject evolutionary theory. I have no doubt that most of the people in this room realise that's not actually representative of how most people engage with either their own personal faith or scientific evidence or inquiry. The other driver to the increasingly polarised public intellectual debate is the perception of dogmatic behaviour at the opposite ends of the spectrum. Those that take a new atheist scientism perspective accuse theologians of slavishly adhering to inflexible or literal textual interpretations, whilst rather ironically, in some cases portraying a version of scientific research which inadvertently leads some to believe that once a scientific fact is proven, it is left unchallenged by future generations of scientists. These representations of both science and theology, as I'm sure you'll agree, are both woefully inadequate. However, I would argue that this representation of two perpetually warring sides is not actually representative of the public's response to their own faith perspectives and the acceptance or understanding of evolutionary theory. To extend on this point, I would like to explore some of the work that was undertaken by the British Council under the previous project I ran, which was called Darwin Now. So, okay, this is one of the activities we ran under Darwin Now. We had an international exhibition that was shown simultaneously in 51 countries. So, during 2009, we ran Darwin Now as the British Council's contribution to the international celebration of the 200-year anniversary of Darwin's birth and the 150th anniversary of the publication of On the Origin of Species. The project ran from June 2008 to June 2010 in over 50 countries worldwide. It included a whole host of different types of activities aimed at a range of different audiences. So there were public lectures, symposiums, science festival events, international exhibitions, academic and policy-facing activities. We ran small research grant schemes and networks, and we ran another number of high-profile symposium and conferences. Alongside this, we also included a number of educational activities aimed at school students and teachers, including workshops, school events, and the production of freely available educational materials and museum-based activities. Alongside this, obviously, we also ran a core digital and media strategy in partnership with organisations like the BBC World Service. The British Council is in a rather unique position to deliver a science communication project of this kind, given that we have offices in over 110 countries worldwide. This not only enabled us to work with partners in each country, but also to involve members of the academic and science communication community from a number of different countries in truly internationally focused events. This wide-ranging project gave us, as I'm sure you'll agree, a rather unique insight into the communication of and the public perception and engagement with Darwinism and evolutionary theory in a truly global context. And obviously this is the first time that a project of this kind has been run. There are, of course, some very significant issues to consider when communicating what can sometimes be seen as a rather controversial idea across so many different cultural contexts. The most significant debate across many of the countries we worked in, so it ran as a recurrent theme, was actually the science-religion debate. Unfortunately, obviously, the common conception of evolutionary science necessarily challenging religious or faith perspectives can act as a significant hindrance to communicating Darwinism, as some publics may be inclined to think that there is no middle ground. However, the idea that there is a necessary conflict between evolutionary science and religion is an erroneous one, which neither reflects the historical acceptance of Darwinism, nor, as I will argue, does it reflect the mainstream public perspective. A really important point to make here is that whilst taking a culturally sensitive approach, which obviously we had to be aware of the cultural context and the contingencies in each of the countries in which we were working, there is a very big difference between wanting to challenge and tackle the rise of creationism or intelligent design, which are at their heart, I would argue, born out of a political agenda or an anti-scientific agenda. And there's a very big difference between wanting to challenge those politically driven or anti-scientific stances and taking an intentionally anti-religious stance when communicating evolutionary science. Darwin now then explored the relationship between evolution and religion in an unprejudiced and open way. It really sought to create safe spaces for publics and our other audiences to engage in dialogue about the key issues surrounding evolutionary theory, and also to access resources that explored the core content of evolutionary theory in an unprejudiced way. So we really looked at ways that we could discuss the historical context of Darwin's work, the evidence for evolution, its relationship to faith, and the way in which evolutionary science has diverged into exciting new areas of research today. As part of the delivery and development of the Darwin Now project, we undertook a poll with Ipsos Mori in 10 countries around the globe. These included the US, the UK, Mexico, Argentina, Spain, China, Russia, India, Egypt, and South Africa. This poll was undertaken through April to May 2009 and was conducted in most countries through a face-to-face poll, so in 6 countries via face-to-face polling, and via telephone polling in Mexico, Argentina, China, and the USA. There were 10 questions in total. The italics in the slide refer to the Oxford English Dictionary's classification. So creationism is the theory which attributes the origin of matter, the different species of animals and plants, etc., to special creation. The important thing to note here is that each individual species would, under this model, be created individually by a means of special or divine creation. In this view, there is no evolutionary process at all, especially when it comes to the soul. Note that this term was not really in use until the mid-19th century, but even in the way that we use it today, is very different from the way that it would have been used in the mid-19th century. The other approach that people tend to think of when they contemplate creationism is young earth creationism. So the perspective that not only are there special instances of creation in terms of the origin of species and living beings, but also that geological time cannot be more than 10,000 years. There are a number of different significant distinction between theistic evolutionary approaches and creationism. So here she's thinking of the bottom here where we see theistic evolutionism. She's suggesting that this is an allegorical interpretation of religious texts which allows for evolutionary theory. This is an approach, obviously, that you're probably all familiar with, adopted by a large number of theistic approaches and deistic perspectives. Another grouping not captured here are those that would take a human exclusionist stance, so those that accept evolutionary processes by means of natural selection for all species, but many make the assumption that Darwin explores the nature of the first origins of life. Obviously there are those who are researching these areas of work within evolutionary biology today. But there is not necessarily an exclusion here of God as first cause, or a deity as a meta-cause. And this is something which is sometimes implied as intrinsic within Darwin's work. And it's also sometimes seen to be intrinsic within evolutionary science today. But again, that takes us into the realms of philosophical discourse. One of the other areas that is important to note here is agnostic evolutionism. And again, when I referred to some of Darwin's more ardent supporters, obviously one of those I was thinking of was Thomas Henry Huxley, who coined the term agnosticism. He first appeared in 1868. Thomas Henry Huxley is most famously known as Darwin's bulldog. And it's important to note that Huxley distinguished himself. So when we're looking at the historical context, we need to remember that there's a very different set of debates going on in the late 19th century to those that have been going on in the past decade. Another area that obviously is encapsulated in the sliding scale is intelligent design. This is a more recent addition to the creationist stable. The intelligent design movement really began in earnest in the 1980s as an anti-evolutionary movement which sought to create a kind of creationist. This includes the young Earth perspectives, old Earth and progressive creationists. The key point though, at the heart of this movement is that it's a version of creationism, and that intelligent design is not mutually compatible with any form of evolutionary approach. So within the intelligent design community, those that uphold a theistic evolutionism perspective are not welcome. Okay, so after that quick skip through what we mean by creationism and the various different approaches that are there, the key point to take away is obviously that what we were interested in is separating out the creationist approaches from the theistic evolutionary approaches. So I'll just skip on to the data that we collected as part of the poll for Darwin now. So the first question that we'll be looking at is the one that asks, which of these comes closest to your own view about the origin of species, including humans and the development of life on Earth? Okay, so there are a number of responses that we put in place, obviously with the caveat that this kind of international poll is indicative and not necessarily sociologically in depth. So the responses we gave were that life on Earth, including human life, was created by a God and there has always been existent in its current form. This broadly categorised encompasses a number of the creationist approaches on the top end of Eugenie Scott's sliding scale. The second response is that life on Earth, including human life, evolved over time as a result of natural selection in which God played no part. Obviously, this is really at the other end of the scale in terms of those that would take an atheistic stance towards evolutionary science, or a wholly materialistic stance. The fourth response is life on Earth, including human life, has evolved over time in a process guided by God. Now, obviously, this is trying to make a distinction between the theistic evolutionist stance and the creationist stance. Oh, and I concede here that obviously these categories themselves in further work need to be refined even further. And then there was a response that says, I have another view on the process, and obviously don't know response as well. The key point here is that in previous polls that have been done, the option that allowed for an evolutionary theistic approach was often left out. So in previous polls it tended to be that you had to choose between being an evolutionary theorist who saw no role for God, or lumping yourself into a camp with people that have a more creationist stance. So it meant that people who are comfortable with evolutionary theory but also have personal faith were left in a bit of a quandary as to how they would respond to these questions. So what we were seeking to do with this poll was really pull out some of the more refined data. We did want to add in a category about intelligent design, but given that intelligent design is a movement that is predominantly most well known in the US, it was felt that it would be confusing to respondents and unnecessarily skew the responses, because it's an area of discourse that people are not necessarily familiar with outside of the US context. Okay, so to skip through some of the results, we found that only in China did the majority think that life on Earth evolved over time as a result of natural selection alone. And in China, 2/3 believe this, rising to 3/4 in the younger groups, so the 18 to 24-year-olds. In all the other countries polled, fewer than half think that natural selection without any role for a deity is responsible for all life forms on Earth. However, in most countries, over half believe in some form of evolutionary process, either through natural selection in its materialistic form or guided by a god. Reflecting the levels of understanding of evolution in Darwin in the main, it is normally the younger age groups, particularly the 18 to 24-year-olds, who think that evolution occurs solely by means of natural selection. There are two exceptions to this. Egypt, where few of any age group are of this belief, and Britain, where it's actually the 35 to 44-year-old age group that are most likely to uphold a broadly atheistic version of evolution by means of natural selection. And the UK is quite an interesting case study in this point, because obviously it's the country where the new atheist discourse is probably strongest. Similarly, in most countries, men tend to be more likely than women to uphold this perspective. The lowest level of those who uphold a broadly atheistic version of evolution by means of natural selection is evident in Egypt, just 2%, and South Africa, 6%, followed by the US, 13%, and India, 20%. Indeed, in South Africa, only 1/4 of those polled believed in some form of evolution, the most popular view being that life was created by a god and has always existed in its current form. So that's 43% overall, and that rises to 59% in those aged over 65. 2/3 in total believe in a god's fundamental role in the development of life on Earth. I'm using the term god or deity here because obviously we also polled in India. In Egypt, the most popular view is that life on Earth over time evolved over time in a process guided by God. So that's 50% overall, and 56% actually in the 18 to 24-year-olds. Though a large minority, 1/3, believe that life is created by God and has always existed in its current form. So in total, therefore, 83% believe that a god has been responsible for the development of life on Earth. However, there is an interesting contrast here with the religious perspectives elsewhere. In Egypt, the most popular view, again, is that all species, including humans, have evolved over time, unlike in South Africa and the US and India, where, again, the majority believe in God's involvement. And the most popular view is the creationist one. This supports the anecdotal suggestion that we encountered in Egypt, that it's more macroevolution and not microevolution that's seen as problematic, and that geological time does not pose such a significant problem as it does, for example, in the US. So young Earth creationism is not as predominant in the Egyptian context as it is elsewhere. And again, this comes back to that question of human exclusionism and the possibility that there has been changes in the human species during the existence of the human species, but not necessarily that the human species has evolved from other species. The American people are divided in their views, though. 45% accept evolution, either via natural selection or influenced by a deity, whereas 43% hold the view that life has always existed in its current form and was created by a god. This really obviously reflects the ongoing debate about creationism and intelligent design in the US. There's also a similar divide among Indian people, although on balance they accept evolution, 52% versus 43%. We also have to acknowledge that in the Indian context, the questioning would probably need to be refined even further in relation to the different faith perspectives we would encounter there. In comparison, few other countries take the view that life has always existed in its current form, created by a god. No more than a quarter do so. So Russian and Chinese people are least likely to think that life has always existed in its current form, so 13% and 7% respectively. There's clearly a broad range of perspectives, and as the results show, the views do not simply fall into discrete polar opposites. One question this throws up is why do we tend to think of there being such a stark division between evolutionary science and people's personal faith? Do the public feel that there is a necessary conflict between evolutionary science and religion? Okay, so the other question that I wanted to look at, and obviously these results, I'll run through a little and some of the cross-correlations that we've done with them. So the other question I want to look at is to what extent do you agree or disagree that it's possible to believe in a God and still hold the view that life on Earth, including human life, evolved over time as a result of natural selection? So obviously we've got the, as I'm sure you can see here, agree strongly, tend to agree, neither agree or disagree, tend to disagree, disagree strongly, and don't know. Most encouragingly, in all the countries polled, more people agree than disagree that it is possible to believe in both the existence of a God and accept that evolution occurs through a process of natural selection. Now, the respondents are obviously not necessarily talking about their own perspective, they're talking about regardless of their own perspective, so they're talking about whether other people, whether it's plausible for other people to hold this perspective as well as themselves. Again, in Egypt, people's view was actually more polarised than elsewhere, with 45% agreeing that it's possible to believe in a God and evolution at the same time, and 42% disagreeing. Views tend to be strongly held in this context, with 37% strongly disagreeing and 34% strongly agreeing. Views are also fairly divided in China, where 39% agreed and 31% disagreed that both beliefs can be held at the same time. Views in other countries are a little less polarised, though in the US there is a significant minority, 28%, who feel that both beliefs cannot be held at the same time. This is, in the US context, an opinion that is more likely to be held by those that take a creationist stance. So 44% of those that take a creationist stance feel that it's not possible to believe in a God and evolution at the same time, and 33% hold that view very strongly. This is also the case in Egypt, South Africa and Russia. However, interestingly, in the UK, Spain, Argentina and China, it is those that uphold those who uphold an atheistic version of evolution by means of natural selection who are most likely to think that the evolutionary theory and a faith perspective are not compatible. People in India are the most likely to agree that it's possible to believe in both a God and evolution. So 85% agreeing and 44% of those agree strongly. And very few, in comparison to the other countries, disagree. And again, I think this shows that there's probably some more interesting research to be done in India, given the different faith contexts that you'll find in India. So the key takeaway message really from these polling results is that it indicated that in all 10 countries polled, the majority of people felt that it was possible to believe in both a God and think that evolution occurs through a process of natural selection. I'd like to just take a very quick look at the results for UK and Mexico to this question, to look at why people might be rejecting the stance that allows for accommodation of both a faith perspective and acceptance of evolutionary science. So just to look at the breakdown for UK and Mexico. Just to run through the UK ones. In the UK, those that felt it was not possible to believe in a God and think that evolution occurs through a process of natural selection numbered only 18%. What was really interesting is that of those who responded negatively, only 24% of them, those that felt that there was a necessary clash, Only 24% would class themselves as holding creationist perspectives, whilst 54% of those who thought there was a clash between holding a belief in God and thinking evolution occurs through a process of natural selection class themselves as upholding an atheistic perspective on evolution. Perhaps unsurprisingly in the context of the UK, where, as I've said, the new atheist stance has been quite prevalent in the communication of evolutionary science, it's the atheistic respondents who felt more strongly about the division between faith and science. If we look at the approaches in science communication are key. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a historian and philosopher of science, it generally was. Yeah. We need to be more clear here on how we outline not only the debates around evolutionary science, but how science works and the nature of science as a practice. One of the other conclusions was that there needs to be a clear delineation of scientific evidence from personal belief and ideology. And this is integral at both ends of the spectrum. So when we talk about separating scientific evidence from personal belief and ideology, we are not just talking about separating it from a creationist stance, we're talking about separating it from a politically driven atheistic stance as well. Whilst rejecting intelligent design approaches to education around evolutionary theory, there was also a strong rejection of taking educational approaches that promoted an atheistic stance towards science education. We have to remember, in its extreme form, scientism is an ideology as well. There was clear concern that these approaches need to be reflected in the way that the media report on evolution. Public perception of a dichotomy is often used as a reason for setting up creationism versus evolution style articles and debates. However, this is not reflected in the way that public seem to be approaching evolutionary theory, as our poll indicates. This process of polarisation between evolutionary science and religion is more of a historical construction, of a kind of historically naive and in some places ahistorical tendency in science communication, and it's now become a media touchstone. I've lost count of the amount of times that I've heard the mythology from a number of people across different professions that before Darwinism there was just creationism and nothing else. And then in this context people are talking about creationism in the modern sense of the term. The other myth that you often hear is that all those who were religiously minded struggled with or opposed Darwin's ideas after the publication of Origin of Species. And again, obviously, this is historically quite inaccurate. Even a cursory glance at the historical evidence shows that this is a highly flawed and misrepresentative approach to science communication. If our aim is to communicate science in an open and accessible way, I personally think we need to be a little more refined in the way that we communicate Darwinism. These debates need to be carefully unpicked by highlighting the historical dimensions and the philosophical context of evolutionary thought. And if there's one thing I think that has come out of the abundant global celebrations of the Darwin anniversaries, is that this more refined perspective is beginning to come through. So what role can open intercultural dialogue play in allowing for encouraging more effective science communication engagement with globally diverse audiences? I think really one of the things we have to look at is the historical roots of science communication itself. Popular science has a changing meaning since its first kind of broad inception in around the 1830s. In its original conceptualisation, and here I'm talking of the US context because that's the area that I'm most familiar with in my research, it was at the beginning very driven by a number of political and social factors. As we moved through into the early 20th century, part of the process of professionalisation of science was the creation of contemporary notions of a scientific community as distinctly separate from any notion of public culture. However, this conceptualisation ignores the fact that a principal audience for any form of science communication are its own practitioners or emergent practitioners and students. It's now clear that there is an interchange between science and public, as popular science is used as a way to communicate with members of one's own discipline or other scientific communities. Interplay between scientific communities, communicators, policy and public contributes to the way in which disputes are resolved and how consensus is achieved. This process of professionalisation in the sciences was very heavily linked in to the early promotion of Darwinism as a theory, which enabled those who sought to professionalise science to tackle the more conservative establishment. Most famously here, of course, we go back to Thomas Henry Huxley. This process has more recently been taken as a historical example used to support the representation of a necessary clash between science and religion. This in turn was part of a move to delineate what constitutes proper science, and this is intertwined with the notion of the separation of science from the rest of culture. So as we move through the 19th century and through the early 20th century, you move from an idea of science of the people, so people being actively participating in the knowledge production of science, to a science for the people. We move from a perception of science as part of everyday culture towards a perception of science as being separate from culture. We need to be really, really careful not to take an approach in contemporary scientific communication that re-entrenches the now largely redundant political narratives of the late 19th century. Science communication is a very valuable resource, not only for society, but also for scientists. And this is becoming much more widely recognised. In this age of web-based information, it should move away, perhaps, from the top-down paternalistic approach and aim to provide tools for the public to critically engage with the sciences on their own terms. Science communication isn't simply about presenting one's own hypotheses or worldview to the amorphous mass we like to call the public. Communication is an important factor, not only in the way in which the public engages with the scientific community, but also in the way that different scientific disciplines engage with one another. Science itself is not an amorphous mass entity. Science is a group activity involving a number of different communities. One issue that becomes self-evident when exploring the history of a concept like evolution is that the different disciplines understand the concept in very different ways depending on their research focus. A microbiologist will look at heredity or even the concept of what a species is in a very different way to a zoologist. Beyond the biological sciences, a computer scientist might understand a selective process in a very different way to a physicist. We are, after all members of the public. We're all part of that amorphous mass, and we should not forget that when we look at science communication and the way that there is a process of appropriation from knowledge production that feeds back into the activity of science itself. As as I found through working on the Darwin Now project, it's by reawakening the public discourse through reciprocal dialogue about people's genuine concerns about the role of science in society that we can learn to better understand one another and to recognise that the clash we hear about so often in public intellectual discourse is not the only, or indeed the majority view. Although many may not recognise it, there is at the heart of the science and religion debate a number of clear ideological drivers from both ends of the spectrum, and these need to be openly explored and examined as part of the process of communicating scientific data. The process of delineation and the discussion about the role and nature of science have to be key here. The way science works as a process and a practice, the role of the expert, and the way that scientific communities work and the nature of consensus. So I'll just give you a quick example of one of the ways that I think that this is problematic in the way that evolution has been communicated. Again, this is an example from the UK. One of the things that you come across in some of the more public dialogue about neo-Darwinian perspectives and creationism is that the threat of creationism is used as an argument by certain members of the scientific establishment for not putting forward non-gene-centric perspectives that might be seen to challenge neo-Darwinism. So here, obviously, I'm looking at ideas around epigenetics, in earlier work looking at ideas around jumping genes, and also lateral gene transfer. The idea that science is dogma and does not change over time is one that we see reflected back in creationist discourses. So, for example, the areas I've talked about that challenge neo-Darwinism quite often get labelled Lamarckism, and you will see on some of the creationist websites, for example, that recent research that has been labelled, again, slightly ahistorically, as Lamarckism, show that Darwinism is a theory in crisis and that Darwin was wrong. So at both ends of the scale, you've got a restriction, a dogmatic approach to the way that science works. So a good example of this concern in the way that science is communicated occurred in 2009 in the public debate about the front cover of the UK periodical New Scientist. On the 24th of January 2009, they printed an edition which was provocatively titled "Darwin Was Wrong, Cutting Down the Tree of Life." So that was on the front page of New Scientist, and they had a picture of the Tree of Life. And this title, understandably, elicited a strong response from some members of the scientific community, but actually it referred to an article about horizontal gene transfer. So one of the people that spoke quite vocally against this front cover, Darwin was wrong, was Richard Dawkins, who some of you may be aware of, others may not. But Richard Dawkins is a well-known science communicator and a proponent of new atheism. And he responded quite emphatically. And he commented in a public lecture not long after the publication that, and I quote from Richard Dawkins here, "Already, all over the United States, creationists are waving this copy of New Scientist as if triumphantly. They don't bother to look inside the magazine, as the editor must surely have known when he sanctioned that headline, a disgraceful piece of publicity seeking." Okay, so he obviously has fairly strong views on this. I personally don't agree with him on this one. As much as evolutionary science is foundational for modern biology and obviously biomedical sciences, and as such offers clear benefits to humanity, there comes a point that we just have to accept there will always be a minority who believe in a creationist account of the origin of species. We should not treat science communication as a potential conversion experience for this group. Nor should we shy away from openly discussing new innovations in biological research, lest they become used in a way that might undermine the wider acceptance of evolutionary theory. To give a rather silly a kind of comparison, one could equally argue that there will always be people who think they have been abducted by aliens. Should we refrain from talking about the possibility of bacterial life on Mars because it might give fuel to alien abduction theorists? Clearly this is nonsense. So why should we not publicly debate certain aspects of exciting new developments in evolutionary biology, even if they challenge the neo-Darwinian perspective? It would be a great shame if the threat of creationism were to discourage us from debating any relevant challenges to the current Darwinian model of evolution, lest we become dogmatic ourselves. But these perceptions of a clash and the explorations of these ideologies can also conversely unite us. It's through dialogue about our shared concerns that we can build a better understanding of one another and challenge the prejudices and misconceptions that we all hold, however well-meaning we may be. Dialogue that does not seek to just find common ground and move on, rather dialogue that seeks us to enable us to respect the opinions or approaches of those with whom we may not necessarily always agree. It is only through understanding and respecting difference that we can clearly see that which unites us, the shared sense of wonder about the way that the universe works and the questions about the true nature of reality, the truly big questions about the world around us that face all of us today. So ones that tend to play out who are we? Why are we here? And perhaps more importantly, given the current situation globally, as a global society, where do we go from here? And to exclude that dialogue means that we won't be able to find consensus and reciprocal opportunities to answer those questions together. Thank you.